Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Videodrone. Today, I want to talk about one of the strangest, most fascinating, and most unlikely classics of the genre known as film noir, Edgar G. Ulmer's Detour. How is it that one movie is said to have inspired both the ironic fatalism of the Coen Brothers and the dreamy irrationality of David Lynch? What single film could have possibly influenced artists so disparate, on top of others like Joe Dante, Martin Scorsese, Wim Wenders, Guy Maddin, and Guillermo del Toro? Why, it could only be Detour. Al Roberts, played by Tom Neal, is a down-on-his-luck piano virtuoso. Slumming it in a cheap club, he falls in love with the heavenly Sue, played by Claudia Drake. Sue moves to Hollywood to pursue an acting career, and Roberts decides to hitchhike across the country to join her. After he's picked up by a sleazy character named Haskell, played by Edmund McDonald, his life begins to descend into an inexplicable disarray of accidental murder and assumed identity, before he ends up at the mercy of the hellish Vera, an especially menacing and unforgettably venomous femme fatale, played by the aptly named Anne Savage. Detour was a small, unassuming production born on Poverty Row, a term used to describe the bargain basement production houses that sprang up around Hollywood's golden age. Not quite independent, but not quite mainstream either. These companies were sort of an adjacent industry, producing an endless stream of cheap B programmers to fill out the bottom half of double bills, underneath A product from major studios. These films were never really meant to do anything other than turn a small profit, before being tossed aside to make room for the next piece of filler. Detour originated as just another of these B pictures, shot in a few weeks for a paltry sum, with a final cut that runs a lean 68 minutes. The film pretty much came and went on its initial release. It got some good notices, turned a healthy profit, and like many before it, seemed destined to be forgotten. Instead, it lapsed into the public domain, started getting shown regularly on television, and was eventually rediscovered. An enormous critical reevaluation led to the film being selected for permanent preservation in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry in 1992, in the same batch that included Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. How did a cheap B programmer end up in such illustrious company? Well, Detour is a film with more prestige than meets the eye. It was directed by Edgar G. Ulmer, a legendary figure, largely unsung in the pantheon of cinema history, whose career was a fertile mingling of grand ambition and rough pragmatism. Ulmer came from a rather distinguished high art background. Educated in architecture and philosophy, he began his mercurial career in Vienna, doing set design for the celebrated theatrical director Max Reinhardt, before serving a cinematic apprenticeship under Ben-Hur director William Wyler and German expressionist pioneer F.W. Murnau, creator of Nosferatu. A promising studio career was cut short by an affair with a producer's wife, and for the rest of his life, Ulmer had to find work wherever it was available. He spent a few years making what were referred to as ethnic pictures, early independent productions made by and for regional immigrant communities, Ulmer's usually being filmed in Yiddish or Ukrainian. From there, he found his way to the Producers Releasing Corporation, or PRC, the Poverty Row B studio where he would direct dozens of program pictures, including Detour. Compelling on one level, as a hard-boiled entertainment, with its pulpy storyline, despairing and fatalistic worldview, and wonderfully entertaining dialogue, featuring such notable turns of phrase as Vera's famous threat to Roberts, telling him he'll be sniffing that perfume Arizona hands out free to murderers. On another level, the film is an ambiguous masterwork, making exceptional use of the unreliable narrator. Roberts frames the whole story as a first-person flashback, narrated from the stool of a late-night diner, where he sits brooding over his coffee. As he relates to us a highly questionable set of circumstances and a progression of ever more improbable events, he insists directly to the viewer that he is merely a pitiful victim of fate. But the more he tries to convince us, the more desperately he proclaims his innocence, the more guilty he starts to sound. Although Ulmer is forced to make use of B standards like inexpensive locations, stock footage, and second-rate sets for the sake of narrative and financial economy, he manages to simultaneously turn his limitations into a benefit, by way of his European art training and wide range of filmmaking experience. The extremely finite means result in minimal designs that take on an expressionist intensity. Sets are sometimes assembled out of nothing more than light and shadows, or a street sign and a lot of fog. Scenes appear to deliberately omit crucial details, heightening the feeling of distorted, deceitful subjectivity. Even moments that may be nothing more than continuity errors take on a feeling of significance, as if they might be signs of inconsistencies in Roberts' story. For instance, what are we to make of the scene where he talks to Sue on the phone, and for some reason, her side of the conversation is never heard? We see her briefly in a cutaway, but only listening, while Roberts carries on rapidly the whole time, as if he is hearing something that might not actually be there. Then there is the matter of the two murders that eventually fall in his path. Roberts would have us believe they are both accidents, but are they? The particulars are so far-fetched. If you notice, just before the first murder, or accident, depending on what you believe, the man about to die isn't even moving, despite the heavy rain pouring down on him. Is he asleep? Or is he already dead? How credible, really, are Roberts' recollections? We hear him obsessing over money throughout his narration. When a wad of cash comes into play, a motive is established. He denies it, but the possibility exists. Could it simply be he killed for money and constructed excuses afterwards? Could Vera's aggressive and accusatory personality, which dominates the film's second half, be a projection, or even a sort of psychological alibi he invents in his own mind for the sake of lessening his guilt? This sense of ambiguity was no accident. According to Robert Polito in his exhaustively researched essay, Some Detours to Detour, included with a Criterion Blu-ray, the movie originally featured several additional characters and side plots, which Ulmer steadily eliminated throughout shooting and editing. According to available evidence, the final decision to maintain a consistently subjective point of view, which was itself inconsistent and full of suspect motives, seems to have been arrived at very deliberately. I think Roberts is really a murderer in denial. But then again, Ulmer's carefully considered directorial choices, artfully working within the extreme limits placed upon him, allow for a number of additional subtextual interpretations. Polito again offers up some of the most thought-provoking. One theory posits the film as a professional autobiography, with Roberts an analog for Edgar Ulmer. The character, a classical pianist reduced to playing in a dive, perhaps reflects something of Ulmer's own secret feelings, a possible dissatisfaction with the genre material to which he was so often relegated, in spite of his sophisticated European training. Another interesting possibility comes from a reading of the original novel on which the film is based, Martin Goldsmith's Detour, An Extraordinary Tale. In the book, the protagonist, named Alexander Roth, is Jewish, and the story contains a number of references to the Old Testament. These details, and all references to Jewish identity, had to be eliminated from the film to appease the studio censors of the time. But it's interesting to note that the novel's author also wrote the film's screenplay. Ulmer, a Jewish immigrant himself, making the film in what turned out to be the final months of World War II, could have, intentionally or unintentionally, coded in contemporary Jewish fears of persecution. Looked at from this alternate angle, the story can be read as a nightmarish, almost Kafka-esque allegory about a man who, because of some mark fate has placed upon him, will be relentlessly hunted down and judged guilty no matter what he says or does. He has no hope of convincing anyone of his genuine innocence. Once you start diving into it, once you start to understand how this one little movie did something so clever and so unconventional, the threads that lead to later generations of beguiling noir masterworks, from Blood Simple to Lost Highway to Nightmare Alley, become much easier to comprehend. Detour is available on Blu-ray from the Criterion Collection. The film can be viewed for free online since it is still in the public domain, but most transfers are notoriously shabby. Criterion's is sourced from a divine new 4K restoration, and it is undoubtedly the best way to view the film. Included is the aforementioned essay by Robert Polito, a feature-length documentary on Edgar Ulmer, an interview with Ulmer biographer Noah Eisenberg, and a piece on the film's restoration, which demonstrates what a sad state the original elements were in, and how much work had to be done making the film look as good as it does on this disc. It's an entire film course assembled for your home viewing convenience, and I highly recommend picking it up.